All right, this is the Orono Planning Board meeting, December 15th, 2021. The first step is the roll call. We have with us Michael Costello, Dave Thompson, Ashley Case, Krista Swenser, Bob Bayer, excuse me, myself, Judson McIntosh, present. We will need to elevate Bob Bayer to a regular member, and then that's official enough?
Yeah.
Okay. Next step, acceptance of the agenda. Can we get a motion?
I move we accept the agenda as presented.
Second the motion.
Vote?
For the approval of the agenda, Judd McIntosh,
Yes.
Bob Baer,
Approved.
Michael Costello,
Approved.
Dave Thompson,
Approve.
Ashley Case, oh, apologies, Ashley, Krista Swenser.
Approved.
That's 5 in favor, none opposed.
Okay. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes for the November 17th, 2021 meeting. Are there any comments, edits?
I have some edits. All right. Okay, on page 4, second to the last paragraph. Second line, this is the line that starts with podium to introduce. And at the end of that line, it says he was in the process of 72 Main Street. We need to insert buying after process of.
I think we got that one.
Okay. All right, then on page 5. 1, 2, 3. Third paragraph down. First line. It should read, there will be no change in access as opposed to not change.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, and then the next line should read, should have instead of should be minimal.
Okay,
All right. And further down on that same page, let's see. 1, 2, 3. The third paragraph from the bottom, sort of in the middle of that, it starts with because no exterior changes to the building are being proposed. There are, it says there are issues. It should say there are no issues. So no needs to be inserted before issues.
thank you.
Okay, I think that's it. The rest of the minutes are really neat. So I think you just hit a rough spot there.
Thank you.
Any other changes, comments? Right, can I get a motion?
I'll move that we accept the minutes as adjusted.
Can I get a second?
The motion. Second the motion.
Okay, for the approval of the November minutes, Judd McIntosh,
Abstain.
thank you. Bob Baer,
Approve.
Michael Costello,
I approve.
Dave Thompson,
Approve.
Krista Switzer.
Approve.
That's 4 in favor with 1 abstaining.
Thank you, Jessica. The next item is old business. There's nothing under old business. Item number 5 is new business. The first item under that is a drafting use ordinance amendment to create a new process for homestays. I think the first step typically is for you to give us an overview.
Yeah, so in the comprehensive plan, there was a recommendation to insert language around homestays and I think amend some of the language around travelers accommodations. And this idea of homestays was created, which was starting, I think, to become more popular at the time. It included things like Airbnb and, kind of short-term rentals of individual rooms or couches in people's homes that they lived in. And that was seen as a good thing. It was seen as a way of offering a variety and kind of new types of lodging opportunities in the community where, we have, some tourism with the university and people coming to the town to stay and looking for different options potentially. So in the past couple of years, though, we realized that the definition for homestay that we had in the ordinance currently, where it was talking about it needed to be in a single family owner occupied home, didn't really capture what the current practice was for short-term rentals, where a lot of people now are using things like Airbnb to rent out an entire home, an entire dwelling unit, not just a room or two. They want to include the kitchen and the rest of the dwelling as well. A lot of people want to have their single family home and maybe turn it into a 2-family home and rent one of them out on a short-term basis. Or, some people might want to, have an additional property somewhere else in town that they just solely rent out on a short-term basis. So none of this was really captured by the existing ordinance, but we knew it was a practice that was going on in town. And when we brought it to the town council, it was something that they thought was something reasonable and, should generally be allowed, that people can sort of use their homes, as they want in this way. So what the draft amendment does is it kind of proposes to amend the definition for homestay. It splits it into 2 separate categories where you'd have, basically owner-occupied homestays and non-owner-occupied homestays. So an owner-occupied would be, it could be a single-family, 2-family, or multi-family structure. It would just be at least one of the units has the owner-occupant residing in it. And the homestay 2 would be a non-owner occupied situation where none of the units had, the owner occupant. So once that definition is established, it sort of made some other, things in our ordinance a little redundant. So, at the very top of that definition section, you see that we'd be getting rid of our definition for seasonal dwellings. Seasonal dwellings wasn't an actual land use in the ordinance. It was just a definition. It seemed like this recognized practice that sort of, was a long-standing, thing that took place in the community, but really what it was a short-term rental. And that would now fall under, the homestay definition. As far as the zoning goes, it would be treated similar to our other home occupations. So a homestay would be sort of a hybrid between a home occupation and a traveler's accommodation. Recognizing that it takes place in a residential structure and a lot of times in residential areas, but there is some commercial aspect to it. So when you have these owner-occupied situations where the owner is present on the lot, they're able to respond to any issues that might come up, they're able to provide some oversight. Those would be permitted through the code office. And in the non-owner occupied situations, in commercial zoning districts where having businesses is more of a frequent thing, those would also be permitted through the code office, while homestays, non-owner occupied homestays in residential districts like the MDR or LDR, somewhere like that, would require site plan review from the planning board. It would probably be like a home business and how we treat those and the process they go through, where it's more of an abbreviated site plan, where if there's no structural changes or site changes, it would be a more limited application that they would have to go through. But having those non-owner occupied homestays come to the planning board on some basis kind of opens up the planning board's ability to enforce some different things, whether it's a vegetated buffer, if there's a proposed parking expansion, or whether it's bringing in some of our nuisance standards that apply to projects that come to the planning board. It would just involve it would give the town a little more oversight over those projects. But in general, the homestays would be required to follow the performance standards that all home occupations abide by, where they sort of have to maintain their residential appearance. They would be limited in the amount of signage they can have, the amount of parking spaces they could create for the homestay, so that it wouldn't really detract from any residential neighborhood. When we were talking about this with the town council initially, we brought up that some communities where short-term rentals have become more of an issue because they, they're very, tourism-based places. A lot of times short-term rentals can kind of overtake a housing stock and cause, a depletion in a municipality's housing stock. That hasn't really been the case in Orono so far. If you go on to Airbnb at any given time now, you might see 10 units for rent. But what this ordinance amendment would do is kind of create a section in the ordinance where in the future, if any restrictions or standards were necessary, it would sort of create the place in the ordinance for that to take place. It does have a couple of things in there, that if a single unit was, registered as a long-term rental as well as a homestay, that, no matter what combination of activities was happening there, it would still have to abide by our normal family definition, which talks about the number of unrelated people allowed in the unit, things like that. And it talks about, 2A there on page 6 is really, talking about how the homestay would have to take place in an actual dwelling unit as defined by ordinance, not in a recreational vehicle or trailer or tent or something like that. So outside of that, that pretty much sums up the purpose and what we were trying to do with the amendment. Happy to answer any questions the board might have.
So to open it up for board discussion before we open it up to the public. So
I've got a question. How many Airbnb type units do we have in Orono now? Is that something that's public knowledge?
So that's, I was saying, we can do a general search online. We've looked at Airbnb and, there's generally around 10 of them. but Airbnb is not the only service there is, that's just a popular one, so it's hard to say exactly.
They don't have to register.
Well, so that's the thing is, up until now, if you owned an apartment or a second property or something, and you wanted to rent it out on a short-term basis like this, that wouldn't normally be allowed by our ordinance. When this came up with the council originally, the council, was kind of making the point that this is something we think should be allowed in the town. So we're not going to enforce the ordinance, necessarily and go after people who might be doing this type of activity, because the general idea was that we would be working towards amending the ordinance to allow that sort of thing.
So that was a conscious decision made by the council
Yes.
some months ago.
Yeah, I guess it's been a while, because we originally talked about this, say, over a year ago, probably. Town staff attended, I think, several different workshops and trainings around short-term rentals. We brought back to the council different sort of restrictions and standards different communities put in place as far as limiting short-term rentals with either licensing programs or saying, you can only rent out a dwelling unit for X number of days for the year or some things like that. But at the end of the day, the council sort of landed on not really encouraging that and just in general allowing it like we would a long-term rental, but being okay with it following the normal home occupation standards. So yeah, that's sort of how we got here.
I have a couple questions, but I'll open it up to others before I start throwing stuff out there.
Well, I have a comment. And that is that I'm quite comfortable with the homestay one, where there's somebody on the premises who's responsible, namely the owner. But the homestay two looks to me like we're possibly opening up a can of worms. Just because it's already going on doesn't necessarily mean this is something we want to plan for. One of the goals of the comprehensive plan is to have housing for young families. We want to encourage young families in town. Well, if we have people from out of town coming in, buying up houses, putting them on Airbnb, those are houses, likely to be houses that we'd like to see young families in. And then the other issue is, if, say, this place is next to my house, and there's a problem, a very noisy family, say, or a bunch of kids who rented it for a party, that they're there for a couple of days at most, probably. And there's no controlling anything. I suppose I could call the police, but, there's just, I think we really need to think about this business of allowing people to rent houses where there's nobody really there to supervise things.
I could respond to a couple of those. So as far as the number of people that would be able to rent one, you would have to still follow our definition of family, just like any other rental or dwelling unit would. So, in the MDR district, for instance, that would be 3 unrelated people. So you wouldn't be able to have a case where, 5, 10, 15 people rented, an Airbnb in town in a residential neighborhood just for a weekend or something.
How can you tell us how that's going to be stopped? like a long-term rental gets stopped because the neighbors, there's consequence, there's, a lease, people there day after day, week after week, month after month. And so the neighbors can kind of get people involved and do something. But if literally 50 people descend upon a house for 2 days, how do you stop that?
Yeah, I mean, we operate on a complaint-based system.
But even
now
if someone
for-
complains, so
Yep.
the police are gonna go there,
Right.
say, on a 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, there's 50 people here. This isn't okay. And then they say, well, yeah, this is, the two of us signed this lease and this is 48 of our best friends. Like, I don't know how you, not to say that we shouldn't do this, I'm just saying that I already know we have issues with the rentals in NDR and LDR. And I'm concerned that this, I don't know if it'll make it better or worse. I go back and forth, and it could make it better for the people that are not happy with the scenario Krista outlined. But it could make it worse, because I just don't see how we enforce it. I don't see how you stop people renting a house for a weekend. I mean, literally having the college kids rent a house for the weekend and have a big dash. Like, how do you stop that? I don't think there's any way to stop it. I, as a college student, would have loved it. I mean, I know in my day, it would have been, because you're getting away from where you live and there's a consequence.
Sure, I mean, I think for the person renting it out, I mean, obviously, if the police responded and it was, whatever gathering, I mean, any number of ordinances would apply at that point with our disorderly properties and all those sorts of things to deal with the problem, I think, at the time.
If there was like a noise violation, something like that.
Right, but yeah, I mean, just our whole ordinance around disorderly property and, large events and things like that, that the police use currently at any other rental property existing in town, that would apply in a situation like that. So I think, bigger picture is that, so the definition of family applies, so that's a land use thing, it becomes a violation of the land use ordinance for the applicant, they would be in violation of their, the permit or the site plan process. And I think at that point, then, if they're violating what they were approved for, then fines could be had. I mean, yeah, and maybe there could be more detail around, defining,
Yeah, I'm just not,
people actually, the people who actually sign up for the unit itself versus the people that are actually in the room at the time. I mean, like what you're talking about where, yeah, maybe only 2 people, book the unit, but then many more than 2 people showed up. But I think in those instances, then our other disorderly ordinances that deal with those issues would start to come into play there. And the fact that, when you look at a homestay as with all other home occupations, can only have 2 parking spaces dedicated to it. So if there's, a street full of cars parked there because they're having a bunch of people come to a short-term rental unit, that's another violation of that ordinance.
is it like, yeah, I just get into like how this is gonna get enforced. And I think it's gonna be a challenge, because I know as a former landlord, it's a challenge. Like, I've never seen anyone really, like, once you get that permit, that site plan review, like a permit, you probably get pulled pretty easy. But once you go through the planning board, that site plan review, permit or whatever to do it, how do you lose it? Like, can the town just, in an executive meeting, say, no, we're taking that from you. You can't do homestays anymore, and we're gonna start enforcing it. Where we said we weren't gonna enforce it before.
Right, I mean, I think it would be more of a fine for violating the ordinance and coming up with a plan with code enforcement to not have that, whatever that practice was, continue happening.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that's better than just letting it happen, and if someone violates it, then you can say this is completely illegal and go after them. I don't know.
I have a comment. Mr. Chairman. I
Yes, please.
agree with what Krista said originally. I don't care what the ordinances say, you know that if the opportunity is out there, there are people who are going to take advantage of it. And I think that's not the best interest of the town. I think where the owner is required to be on the premises, that's fine, but the owner is not on the premises. I think that's opening up a big can of worms. I would not vote for it.
I think particularly, and I don't know if Krista and you, Dave, I'm concerned about the MDR and LDR. Like, I think in the commercial zones, you know, university zone, even in F&A where there's acres, you know, 2-acre lots or whatever, I'm less concerned, but in the MDR, LDR, where you've got these houses on top of each other, that's where I have more concern, because I just don't see how, if we make this legal, then investors are gonna come in and buy houses, which it may not be a big deal, it may not happen, but now you've created this business model, and then I feel like the council couldn't retract it. You couldn't then pull back on that business model. I think that's really hard and almost unfair to do, right? To be like, okay, everybody go do this, and then 2 years later, people are complaining, and so the council says, now you can't do it, and these business people have bought these buildings, and now they can't effectively use them. I mean, I want to make sure that there would be a mechanism, A, to enforce it. I mean, if I was gonna say this looks good to me, I'd want to make sure there's a mechanism to enforce it, A, and B, there's a mechanism to retract the permit or license or whatever.
So
it
more of
is.
a licensing system maybe than.
Yeah, something, like, and I don't even know, like rental registration, there was really no mechanism to lose that ability, right? I mean, no matter how bad you were as a landlord, I guess there was, if you failed the fire inspection, you know, there was some certain building codes you could get
Right. so
shut down, but
The rental registration is a registration, it's not a license.
Right.
It was meant to collect data, not be a,
right.
so.
And maybe I'm wrong, maybe the stats don't bear that out, maybe the stats say that actually neighborhoods prefer Airbnb versus a long-term rental. Maybe
Yeah.
that's true,
So, I mean, so part of this was we had people in town, you know, coming forward, wanting to do these sorts of things.
right,
You know, I mean, there were in-town people looking to have, you know, other properties that they could take care of in town, offer, you know, an opportunity for people to come stay. But yeah, at the same time, I mean, the things you're bringing up and talking about are concerns with short-term rentals, not just here, but in lots of places.
right,
And that's why a lot of the standards, the enforcement restrictions are put in place in a lot of communities, a lot of cities and, you know, coastal towns and things like that. And they do bring enforcement issues because it becomes hard to enforce those sorts of things because they do happen on a more rotational basis. Yeah, I mean, I hear what the board is saying.
I mean, this brings.
The way-
Go ahead, Krista. No, go ahead. You, go ahead, Krista, you were gonna say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, the way it's worded right now, you know, where Kyle is saying there are people in town who want to have a second building that they're not occupying. But there's nothing in here that says somebody from Texas can't come and buy 6 houses and set them up.
Yeah.
And
I
then
don't know-
enforcement is a long ways away.
And I'm not sure if there's no way to structure anything to prevent that. I mean, that would get.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say in the past, we've gotten much interest in something like that. I mean, it doesn't seem like something that would be likely. Like, yes, the ordinance would technically allow that, but just in practice, I don't think staff has received interest in that, where we have received interest, you know, in some of these other ways. And I mean, I think like I said, you know, part of this was looking at what the existing impact was on the community. And when we looked and there were, 10 or so units in that downtown surrounding area, that were currently being offered. I think that was the stepping stone to say, okay, we can allow this practice, how people are doing it, because the impact so far seems pretty minimal. If all of a sudden it drastically changed, then, maybe we look at doing something different. But that scale of people wanting to come in and buy properties in bulk quantities just to rent out on a short-term basis, we haven't seen that interest. So I don't think that concern initially was there, but it kind of created the room to, step in if that did become an issue.
Yeah, the much more likely scenario, because it is more lucrative, is existing rental properties flipped to Airbnb. Because you can now essentially have the place occupied 10 days a month and make twice the money. So it's a much more lucrative, thing to try, but there's more work involved. Or there's people that manage it, right, for you. There's a lot of businesses that actually do that for you. So I guess
we have seen, people who are interested in the short-term rentals. I mean, similar to a lot of the long-term rentals where they might not live in town, they have local property managers taking care of it. So,
yes, I don't think it's likely that it would change the real estate landscape or blow up. But I think I'm more concerned about the people that have someone next to them today having some dissatisfaction, and then that house next to them turns into a hotel, and they're like, what just happened? Now, in theory, this has been publicized, right? The floor's been open to the council, public comment. Everyone should know about it townwide.
So it hasn't had a public hearing at the council level. The council's discussed it a number of times at the committee level. So I mean, those agendas are posted to the Facebook, and this is a public hearing, and it would have a public hearing with council after this. But yeah, to your point, at those committee meetings, no, there hasn't been a lot of input from the public or comment really for or against it outside of, the people who are interested in actually doing it.
I have a slight comment. I don't want to ramble on. I understand the other council's concerns, but I think maybe part of us, we're focusing too much on the negative TV that we see of Aronubs. We're not a coastal, we don't have an ocean here, we don't have a lake, we don't have a mountain. So I don't think that crowd would be coming here. My assumption, and based on my siblings that rent Aronubs all the time, is they use them as a base and then basically just sleep in them, and they're out all day exploring the local area or the city. My guess is that's what most people would be using these for, or visiting their students at the university. That's all I have.
I think Michael's likely right. It's always it's always the edges that scare me. It's always the 5 or 10% scenario.
Right. I mean, I think the majority of people that are using Airbnb, I mean, the people who are renting out the property on Airbnb can be rated themselves. I don't think, for the most part, they have an interest in maintaining a good property that, remains problem-free. I think most of the time you would probably get parents of local university students who come up and maybe they don't want to stay in a hotel, they want access to their own kitchen or something like that, and those sorts of things. But yeah, obviously the nightmare cases are possible, and we're considering for sure. I mean, just to kind of summarize, I mean, it seems safe to say so far that everyone seems okay with the home state 1, and majority seem okay with the home state 2. There's just concern over the impact on residential areas. Is that?
That's fair to say for me. I don't want to speak for
Yeah.
Dave and Krista.
Right. So Krista, Dave, the comp plan, so we were talking about it, it's right, that one of the goals of the comp plan was to provide more housing opportunities, affordable housing opportunities for young families in particular. So is your biggest worry over something like this in those residential areas like the MDR and LDR? Whereas, these non-owner occupied ones in the village commercial or commercial 2 areas would be, more acceptable, or is it just across the board, you have concerns in all zoning districts? Could you offer some follow-up feedback on that?
I would say that my chief concern is with the residential areas. And I would include F&A in that. There's a number of residential areas in F&A, actually. We're not all rocks and trees. But yeah, my chief concern is for the residential areas.
I kind of have a question or comment, I guess. I wonder if, we could look at existing use, right? So I do know a few people, I'm not necessarily close with them, but I do know a few people who rent them, and I live down the street from one. And it's my understanding that some of the biggest market in this area is like month-long stays for visiting nurses and people using it as like a base to go to Acadia because it's so expensive to stay in Acadia. And it's a little bit less of like young people and things like that. So I wonder if we could get kind of some information about existing use to kind of go on, because, the ratings go both ways. The host gets rated, but the guest gets rated as well. And so, people want to be able to continue to use these services, and their ratings are dependent on it. As far as I can tell from like I said, living down the street from one until I moved, we never had a single noise complaint from, the 2 houses down. It was an Airbnb, but we did from the long-term rental pretty regularly.
Okay, I see your point, and I'm not objecting to homestay 1 where the owner is present. It's the homestay 2 where the owner can be anywhere, and then it's harder to get any kind of issue dealt with.
Well, this was a homestead too that I lived down the street from. It was a building that the owner didn't live in, and it was Airbnb, kind of long and short term. And nobody was ever there. There was like a little key box with the key, and that was the kind of the only interaction you would have with the owner.
So just to bring up, something for some thought and feedback on, we recently amended the rental registration ordinance to include a provision for these sort of situations where you have out of state or, owners that are further away from town that can't respond to issues as quickly. There's a provision added to have a local property manager be required if you were, if the owner was over an hour away from town, basically. Does something like that extended to this, make things more palatable in those areas, or is it still not enough to kind of ease some of the concerns around some of those issues? Having not necessarily the owner in close proximity, but if the owner was further away outside of town, unable to respond to anything in a timely manner, having a requirement for a local property manager, in the near vicinity.
I think that would help a lot.
I think for me, it kind of gets back to what Ashley just said, which was her experience was Airbnb was better than a long-term rental. And for me, it'd be more about the people that have experienced the long-term rentals and getting their take on it. And so that's why I'd be comfortable saying yes to this as it is. And I just want to make sure that those people, you know, because I know we've had that kind of ongoing for years, those people kind of get a say. I mean, that would kind of steer how my feeling is on it, that those people are directly affected by it, what they think about it. That would be my.
The person who leases out on these Airbnbs, they don't have to accept the client. So like Ashley said, they screen the people too. That's someone that's coming into a home that they may be living in or have a child that's going to be living in eventually, and they don't want it to get trashed. It's fully furnished, it's fully kitchened, it's fully stocked sometimes. So they have a personal investment in it too. So they don't just let anyone off the street come in and stay overnight.
Agreed. It could be better.
Yeah.
Good points. Should we open the public comment? We still haven't. I don't know if there's anyone here or not, but I feel like we should. Maybe there is someone from the public here.
If we can ask Bill. Bill, is there anyone, their hand raised for any comment?
Yep, I have Paul Kim with his hand raised. I'm going to go ahead and allow him to speak.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm actually Frida Timms, it's Paul's wife. I'm listening in on this, and we're actually here for the second issue of the meeting, which is the rezoning of the library. But I can speak to this a little bit. We live in the village, and we have rentals, long-term rentals on both sides of our house. And this may not be relevant to, you know, what your council does as far as what you're looking at, but I find that just generally the people renting are less invested in the neighborhood, in the property and everything, which, and we're in a college town, I get that, you're gonna have more rentals, but we already have so many in the village, and adding a whole additional type of rental unit, I do think it's a drawback, because it leaves, you know, houses that are either sitting vacant half of the time, you're not creating any sense of community, and you're adding that to the additional, you know, short-term rentals of college kids. I mean, we have a driveway across from our house, and there's like 5 cars, and I wouldn't call the police on them, but they go in and out all day long, and it certainly destroys the sort of neighborhood feeling, you know. So, I mean, I think that's a consideration when you're thinking about just adding more opportunities to create more rentals in this area. So that's all.
Thank you, Frida. Appreciate it. I think I got your name right.
Yes.
Thank you. Anyone else, Bill?
Nope, that's all.
Thank you. All right, anyone else, any other comments from the board? Discussion? Or I guess I should close the public hearing. Now, any other comments from the board?
Well, I guess I would make a final comment. I think that we're here to do what's best for the town, and what I'm hearing, in spite of all the comments from Kyle, I think that this needs to go back and have the staff tighten it up so that it would be more palatable. I think that the fact you require somebody to be at least an hour away, well, that's quite a ways away, an hour away. How far is that? 40 miles, 60 miles, depends on what road you're on.
No. So the requirement for on the long-term side for rentals is now, if the owner is over an hour away from town, that they're required to have a property manager in town. So the property bonding would be more local if the owner of the property was over an hour away.
All that is in the text now, right?
So that's now on our long-term rental side, or will be. It's going through the adoption process. But it doesn't currently apply to the homestays.
I can't in good conscience vote for something that's not all there. And I think this really needs to be looked at again because there's too many comments have been made that it can be abused and we can go exactly in the opposite direction of what the comprehensive plan wants to. And that is creating more housing for younger families that are starting out. Oh, that's it.
So I guess I'd be looking for some specific direction from the board as far as, this coming back to the planning board with a different revision, that would be this is, at the end of the day, it's a recommendation to the council. So is it, does the planning board want the recommendation to be to consider not allowing non-owner occupied homestays in those residential districts? Is the recommendation to include a provision for a local property manager, specifically in those cases? Or does the planning board want to see some specific language added to the draft, come back to the planning board next month for more discussion? I guess that's the feedback I'd be looking for.
So my position is that I feel like I don't know enough about what the public thinks. Like, we're not elected officials, we're black and white, letter of the ordinance. And so we don't get that public feedback that tells us, oh, this is good, or this is bad, or this is horrible, or this is great. And so this is going to affect, I don't know, 50 families, 100 families, anyone who's got a rental property next door to them that's not owner occupied. And I guess I'd want to get some feedback from that group of people as to how they feel about this. Now, Frida just gave us a comment that she wasn't a fan, but that would be my kind of take on it, is to get, before we create a potential situation, that we get feedback from those people so that everyone goes into it kind of with their eyes wide open, instead of us blindly saying, oh, this looks good on paper, and then we have a problem. So that's my 2 cents, is more information, and the people that are affected by this the most get involved somehow, which I know is a challenge, but I don't think you could change this in some way where I'd be like, oh, now I know it's good. Just because I don't know. I don't know what anyone else thinks.
I understand. It's, in a lot of towns and a lot of communities, these rentals are going on anyway, regardless of what we all know. So however we feel about it, it's going to happen regardless.
Which is happening today. I mean, I don't know if we could reach out to the people next door to the 10 that are being rented today that aren't owner occupied and say, hey.
Right. I mean, so I think that's an important point is, we get calls through code, through law enforcement, on whatever, regular basis, for any number of things, whether it's a response to a noise complaint or and I mean, my position isn't directly tied to enforcement, but, being in the same office as code enforcement, we hear a lot of those things. And I don't believe that, I've ever heard of a case where one of those complaints has come specifically from a short-term rental. I think generally those are longer-term rentals, probably because those are more frequent in the town. There aren't that many short-term rentals. So obviously the number of issues created is going to be less just in that regard. But it at no point it became apparent to the any town staff that we were responding to a more frequent rate of short-term rental complaints, or the ones that were existing were creating problems for surrounding areas. We never got that feedback. That feedback never really came when it was talked about at the committee level in council. So yeah, outside of taking this back to council and saying, the planning board recommends getting more community feedback on this specific issue, which would probably involve holding, it wouldn't just be a council committee meeting. We'd probably have to reach out to the community directly, which the whole idea behind this public hearing, but a more targeted, sort of advertising of, we want your feedback, please come speak with us, about this topic. I mean, that would sort of be I
Next step.
think the only step left, if you were, recommending that we get more information.
I mean, I know this is a hot button issue. It kind of has been long-term rentals. And that's what started the rental registration program in the first place. And so I kind of feel like this is one of those issues where you need to get that community feedback. Now, at the end of the day, the council takes the brunt of it. So if we pass this, but that would be my recommendation, is that we do some sort of outreach and get the community involved, and those that are going to be impacted the greatest and come and speak to it. Because I'm definitely not a fan of passing something and then trying to roll it back a year or two later.
Are there other communities that have this type of regulation or ordinance?
Yeah,
In
it's
the area?
becoming
So, well, why can't we, I would like to know what some of the other communities that have this ordinance, what kind of problems they've had, if any. If they haven't had problems, then that's one thing, but,
Well, so
I
that's
don't know
the
what
thing.
other communities have.
Yeah, a lot of communities are really different. You get, bigger major cities, you get places like Bar Harbor and Camden, and, that have a very tourist-based industry. You get them having stricter regulations around these things because they have a noticeable decrease in their housing stock, from this sort of activity, because people are going in and buying up multiple properties at a time to use for short-term rentals. Then you have other communities who just allow it and don't have any sort of, restrictions on it at all, because, it's either, not an issue for them, or it's just something that, they don't feel is necessary to regulate. Yeah, I mean, so part of, the discussion we had with council leading to this was looking at all of that. And, I mean, the initial draft that council had, some stricter, standards in it, and that was kind of pulled back because the impact that we had seen so far was so small that, it didn't seem like that was where Orono was in the short-term rental spectrum. It didn't seem like we were one of these communities that was being taken over by short-term rentals to the point where it was creating problems in the neighborhood, or, depleting the housing stock to an extent that it was going to be, that noticeable and impactful overall. So I mean, we did try to look at those things and take those into consideration. It wasn't just, saying, yeah, we think it'd be great to just allow these all over the place, and whatever unintended consequences there are, that's fine. So we did try to base it off what other communities in similar positions were doing, and take into account sort of the different options.
So right now, basically, you don't really need it. We're not going to approve this. This is up to city council to approve. You just need us to say, take this back to city council, and this is what you need to look at. This is what we suggest.
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, the planning board's role here is to make a recommendation to council, based on how they think the ordinance amendment fits in line with the comprehensive plan and the goals of the town, and the goals of the land use ordinance. If that recommendation is to get more community feedback and then potentially alter the draft amendment, I mean, that's a valid recommendation that the board can give. If the recommendation is to consider looking more closely at those residential districts, in regards to the non-owner occupied types, I mean, that's a valid recommendation. So So right, at the end of the day, it's the town council's decision whether they approve the amendment or not. But certainly the planning board can make whatever recommendation they think is correct, and the council will take that into consideration. We'll make a report of, regardless of what the recommendation is, I'll be taking all of these comments and compiling them into a report that'll go to council. So the whole discussion will get brought up at the council committee level and for discussion. So yeah.
If we look at the home state too, is it possible to require, if the owner isn't there, a representative of the owner be on site?
On site, or
Yeah, I'm asking.
I mean, it would be possible to say. I think in practice, that's not how a lot of short-term rentals work, because they would need a separate unit to have that person in. And I think a lot of them try to rent out a whole unit, that's privately for the people renting it.
It's a thought. I don't know if it's valuable. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't, in these ordinance reviews, we don't typically see something that could change the landscape of the town over the next 10 years. And I think that the likelihood that this does that is really low. I don't think it's likely. And I don't want to imply that what you did here was not thoughtful. I think it was very thoughtful. I wasn't implying that. But I think it could, because we don't know, and I use Airbnb. I love it. I love going to all these places and using it. But that combined with where Airbnb is going, combined with the pandemic and everything else happening, it's hard to know where it's all going to go. And so that's why I think community involvement is to get community buy-in. Really, it's to not only know what they think, but also, is the community for this or not? Because it is now saying anyone's house can be bought and put on Airbnb, right? Which before that, anyone's house could be bought and there was a long-term rental. But that was much more fixed, right? We knew how many people there were in the area that were going to do long-term rentals. We have a certain set of stock, a certain number of people. Airbnb, it's unlimited. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to come here. They probably won't, but I think it does make sense. Sure. So I don't know if we want to add anything to that recommendation. I don't know if you agree with that recommendation or not, because what he wants is something to take to council to say the planning board doesn't feel comfortable approving this in its current state, or they do feel comfortable, but if they don't feel comfortable, what do they recommend? What would make them comfortable? And so for me, it would be just the community getting involved and understanding the change. I don't know if we want to go any more specific than that. I don't know if anyone's, if you're good to go with it as is, then you could make that statement. Why don't we go around the board? I'm gonna query each one of you. So Michael, where are you?
I'm ready to send it back to council, and I think the draft is good. It probably needs a lot more tweaking, as Krista said, to make it I think part of it is we're not fully understanding of what the rental community is like and what we're up against based on our community. I know we seeing too much negative rental on TV in some of these resort areas. I personally don't think that would be the type of rental we would have here in Orono. Does that help at all, Judd?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that, because I think what he wants is specific things that the council could do to make us comfortable, whether that's specific changes to this ordinance as it's laid out, or specific steps that they could take. And I guess if you out of that, maybe more information about the impact on other college towns with Airbnb, something like that. Is that your?
Yeah, maybe a comparison to like another community like Skowhegan, another college town that doesn't, well, Skowhegan has the snow mountains, has ski resorts. I guess I'm at a loss right now, other than the comments I previously said. It makes sense to me, I guess, right now. Basically, I'm okay with it, but I understand the concerns that our council has and some town folks would have.
Thank you. Dave? Do you have any recommendations, Dave? Any specific recommendations?
Who did you call?
Say that again, Dave. Dave, can you hear me? Can you hear me, David?
Oh, okay, go ahead. Yes.
Do you have
I
any?
would
Yeah.
agree that it would be okay, as far as I'm concerned, if the owner was required to live on the premises. Beyond that, I'd like to have more information on what's going on, what has been found in other communities.
Ashley?
Sure, I'm probably more comfortable with it than I think a few of the other board members are, but I would want to hear both from the renters and also the neighbors. So I would want to hear some more information about what types of experiences the people who are actually renting these short-term properties out, what their experience has been, and who they've rented to and things like that. And I think that would give a lot of clarity. So I think a public hearing where you get some information from stakeholders would be really good.
Thank you. Krista?
I'm comfortable with the homestay 1 and homestay 2, I think needs some work. And I think the things that Ashley has suggested should be part of that. And another part of it that would be very easy to do, if council were inclined to do so, would be to, if homestay 2 is to stay, if in the end we decide that's a good idea, then I think we should add the bit about that if the owner is not in Orono, then there needs to be some local agent who can be contacted about problems and who is actually in a position not just to write down there is a problem, but to do something about it.
Thank you, Krista. Bob?
Yeah, I agree with what Krista just said. Homestay 1 is fine.
Kyle, how's that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it works. I think, yeah, I'll compile all of it. I'll probably talk with some other town staff just to see what they think. Hearing all of it is the best course. We'll take it back to council committee, have a conversation with them. We'll talk about all of the things presented, the sort of information the board was looking for. A lot of it, I'm not sure how feasible some of it will be to get, because I think the issue a lot of communities are having around this is it's a newer thing. So that historical, trends and activity isn't there like it is with a lot of other things. And a lot of when you start to get into, the more restricted, type ordinance language, it does become really hard to enforce. Right. So it presents its own set of problems. But yeah, I mean, I think that works, and I can take that and present it back to council.
Good. Thank you. All right, thanks everyone. So we're ready to go to B. I propose an amendment to the town of Orono zoning map to rezone the following 3 lots to NDR. Kyle, you want to share?
So there are 3 town-owned lots on Pine Street, just across from Pleasant Street. So you have the little over 3-acre lot with the town library, the 1-acre lot with the Birch Street Senior Center, and then a 1/10 of an acre lot, right next to Birch Street there. That's just sort of a drainage area and a few parking spaces. It doesn't actually have any structure or land use on it. So what initiated this was really the library was looking to do a potential addition, I believe, in the future at some point, and through their design work and kind of conceptual phase, they sort of realized that adding on to the front of the structure would be optimal for them. And if you notice, that area right now is zoned as medium density residential, but it's adjacent to the village commercial. So the MDR district has much more strict setback requirements than the village commercial. The village commercial doesn't have a front setback required at all. That's why when you walk down Mill Street, you see the buildings right up to the sidewalk. Whereas the MDR has a 20-foot setback requirement that you see in a lot of the more residential neighborhoods. So it's proposed that we readjust the zoning here to village commercial to allow for that library expansion to be closer to the street. And we thought that that made sense in a few different ways with the comp plan. As I noted in the memo, the comp plan recommended looking at the sort of properties on the boundary of the existing village commercial and whether or not there was any room for expansion in some of those areas. And we've talked about that, I think, before in a couple of different instances on before I was here on Forest Ave, I think, and on Main Street as well. And a lot of what's talked about in the comp plan is kind of growing the downtown area in a compact, walkable manner. Well, when you talk about building closer to the road, easier access from the sidewalk for a town service like the library, it kind of fits in with that, where it's an extension, it's right off the existing village commercial, sidewalks there. If you do build the front of that, closer to that sidewalk, it sort of fits in with that, providing services, more accessibly to people in that downtown area. So we thought it was something that, fit in. The existing use is already there. It's, being town owned, it's unlikely that, the use would change in the future, especially when you're looking at the library lot. It looks bigger when you first look at it. There's some undeveloped land towards the back, but you start getting into some pretty difficult to develop natural conditions back there. So the fact that it's zoned as village commercial probably won't have any impact on that area, because whether it's MDR or village commercial, it's probably unlikely to ever be developed anyway. And I think in general, when we looked at other kind of uses in the village commercial, you have the town office, you have the public safety building, you have the Keith Anderson building, which is sort of the end of the village commercial on Bennett Road. So it sort of made sense as a landmark point, that on this end of the village commercial, you have a sort of aesthetic landmark that people could point to as sort of the cap of the downtown on that side of the district. So that was sort of the reason for the proposal coming forward, at this particular moment, and some of the reasoning that we put in behind it. So open it up to any questions or feedback on the board.
So I'll open it up for comments before we open up the public comment.
I have none. It's pretty straightforward to me.
Go for it. Go ahead, Michael.
No, I said I have no comments. I'm okay with it.
Oh,
Okay. I think it's a good idea. I've been involved with the plantings behind the library, so I have spent a fair amount of time in that area. I know it fairly well. And, being familiar with it, it seems, and looking at the map, how it is immediately adjacent to area that's already village commercial. It just makes imminent good sense.
Anyone else have a comment about the zone change?
No, I'm fine with it. I think it makes sense.
Okay, let's go ahead and open up the public hearing, public comment section and see what they have to say. Val, is there anyone there with their hand raised?
I will allow them to speak now.
Hi, it's Frida again. Sorry. I have no problem with the library thing. I think that's great. My question is, I was just curious why the senior center property is included in the rezoning and if there are specific plans for that or whether that is likely to ever be sold and turned into something different. So I just had that question.
Sure. So the reason that we included all three parcels was just because they're all town-owned land, sort of adjacent to each other. And that there are no, I think, plans to expand the senior center currently. But that, you know, the use that was happening there with the senior center was sort of fit more in line with the village commercial district than the MDR district. And if there was ever to be any sort of expansion there, you know, like the library is going through now, that this could potentially make that process easier in the future. But no, I don't think there's any anticipated change of use there or change out of, you know, town hands. It just sort of seemed to make sense to sort of lump this into one zone change with those all being town-owned lots, and sort of non-residential uses. It made more sense bringing those out of the MDR together into that downtown district.
Cool. Well, thank you. That's an excellent answer. That's all I wanted to know. Thank you for listening.
Sure thing.
That's everybody.
Okay. Are there any other? Ashley, Bob, any comments about this?
Easy.
Easy. So do we even need to take a vote or can we?
I think just, you know, recommended that it.
I think the consensus is everyone's good with it. That, I think Krista, Michael, and Dave explicitly stated that. Ashley nodded. Bob nodded.
I have one further comment. As a senior citizen, I would hope that at some point that facility might be upgraded a little bit.
Birch Street, right? Not the library?
Senior citizen, the Birch Street, old Birch Street School, which when I first came to town was a school, but now it's a senior center.
That works.
All right, we'll close the public hearing, which I should have done, I think, before that last bit. And I think we're done with new business.
Yes.
All right. B was much better than A. A was a rough one. Where's Phil when you need him, right? All right, item 6, discussion. Any discussion?
So just to talk about it, as of now, there's nothing in for January. So it's possible that we don't have a January meeting. Obviously, we'll talk to council about next steps for the homestay ordinance. So maybe that's ready to come back in some capacity, or maybe we extend that out. There was one thing that I thought might be ready for January. We haven't received anything yet. It's in by early next week. We could still end up having it on the agenda for January, but yeah, just we'll keep in touch and let you know what's happening.
All right, item 7, adjournment. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Second,
We need to adjourn. Do we need to vote for that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, man.
to adjourn the December meeting of the planning board, Judd McIntosh,
Yes.
Rob Baer,
Yes?
sorry, Bob Baer, Michael Costello,
Yes.
Dave Thompson,
Yes.
Krista Switzer.
Yes.
That's 5 in favor, none opposed.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
We have a-
I've only been